The emotional exorcism of Charles Leclerc's Monaco maladies this year got me thinking about that select few from F1 history who can proudly boast a home Grand Prix win on their resumes. Did you know that of the 115 drivers to have won a Formula One Grand Prix as of the 2024 Azerbaijan Grand Prix, just 35 of that crew have won in their backyard? Granted, that list does include a host of Finns, Kiwis and Venezuelans who have never been blessed with the opportunity to do so. But take those names out of the mix and you still have a big old chunk of drivers who either have not or might never win at what many would deem one of the most important places to do so. So my attention turned to those names, specifically who of them had taken part in the most home Grand Prix without ever winning. In joint third place on 17 attempts apiece, we have Riccardo Patrese, the Italian veteran who held the record for most Grand Prix starts for 20 years, and Britain's double world champion Graham Hill. In the silver medal spot is another British champion, Jenson Button, who never even stood on the podium at Silverstone in 18 years, never mind on the highest of those steps. But none, bar those who have impressively clicked on this video without reading the title or thumbnail, will be surprised to see that in first place, only on this list and never at home, from 19 times, is Brazil's own Rubens Barrichello. And you may well say, so what, Chicane? That's basically the same number as those other 3 old-timers. Is this really worth delving into? What makes the tale of Barrichello's Brazilian blues one worth mulling over? The difference is one of opportunity. It's all well and good entering your home event so many times, it's whether you were ever provided the opportunity to actually win it. Take another F1 veteran like Jarno Trulli, who started 15 races at his native Monza circuit, but arguably only ever sat in what you would call race-winning machinery on 2 occasions, and never in the best car. If we classify a World Championship winning car as the best car of the year, how often did our quartet receive the opportunity to sit in the fastest machinery at their home circuit? Patrese just once. Button the same. Even Hill just twice. Whereas Rubens had the class of the field beneath his Brazilian buttocks on 6 occasions. Add to that another 3 cars that were race winners in that same year, another 4 that recorded podiums, and he received the rather baffling result of a best finish of just 1 lonesome 3rd place. The question then is, how did none of those opportunities materialise into a home Grand Prix win? Was Barrichello just more unlucky than a man smashing a mirror with a black cat whilst walking underneath a ladder? Was Rubens one of F1's biggest chokers? Or was that number of opportunities a lot smaller than a first glance would suggest? Let's take a look. Many of us may recall Barrichello as the journeyman racer with a silly podium dance to boot, so it's perhaps good for us to start this story with a sense of perspective of just how a much younger Rubens was viewed upon his debut. One could potentially draw parallels with the likes of a Max Verstappen or Kimi Antonelli, in that he was a hotly tipped young talent who raced through the junior categories into F1 faster than it takes Esteban Ocon to get a penalty. With a swath of Brazilian karting trophies to his name, 17-year-old Rubens moved across to the UK in 1990 and quickly discovered a need to expand his trophy cabinet. The teenager was first Formula Vauxhall Lotus champion and then followed that up with the British Formula 3 title. A first and only year in Formula 3000 F1 second tier saw him rank 3rd. With such rapid and successful progress, it was only natural that the big wigs in F1 were keeping an eye on the young gun, and it was one Eddie Jordan who snapped up Rubens in November of 1992. Within 6 laps of his first test, he was lapping faster than Jordan's 92 driver, Stefano Medina. His first run at Interlagos was just his 2nd F1 race, and though perhaps shrouded by Ayrton Senna's final home win, Rubens enjoyed a quietly impressive hometown debut. Despite gremlins in his gearbox and engine throughout practice and qualifying, Rubens still soared as high as 3rd on Saturday morning before eventually starting in 14th place, as opposed to veteran teammate Ivan Capelli, who was rock bottom and failed to qualify. He steadily worked through the pack before his maiden voyage came to a halt on lap 14, defeated by those pesky gearbox hydraulics once more. Rubens returned to Brazil the next year with his stock substantially higher. The race after Brazil 93 at Donington is widely remembered for one of Senna's more brilliant wet weather drives, but Rubens had his moment in the metaphorical sun that day too, as he ran a dizzying second at one point, having negotiated past the dominant Williamses and looked set for a maiden podium before his fuel ran dry. It seemed as if Jordan, as they had done with Michael Schumacher previously, had unearthed a new superstar. The remainder of the year hadn't hit those same headlines, but there was a quiet confidence emanating from Jordan going into 94. Barrichello and new teammate Eddie Irvine were looking very rapid in pre-season testing, and it was mooted that this could be a car capable of podium finishes. Alas, pre-season testing pace and reality are two different things, as F1 teams have ably demonstrated over the years, and Rubens was only 14th on the grid for the season opener on home soil. Eyes turned instead, naturally, to Senna, on pole for his debut for Williams and who led the first 21 laps, and then chased Schumacher for another 34 before spinning off. The home crowd, devastated, began to leave in droves, and a great shame too, for Rubens was brilliant that day. He was into the points by lap 17, stormed past Carl Wendlinger to take 5th, and then gratefully inherited 4th after Senna's spin to come home with a career-best result, just 9 seconds shy of Jean Alesi in 3rd. John Watson quipped on commentary, if he'd started further up he could well have been on that podium. Murray Walker proclaimed here was a future world champion if ever I saw one. It seemed it was all coming up Rubens. McLaren even got on the phone about a drive for the next year, what could have been an intriguing prospect as the team joined forces with Mercedes and gradually worked their way back to the very front once more. But the deal never came through, and it would be a long old wait before Rubens got his hands on the race-winning machinery that so many of the time believed he deserved. And it would be an even longer wait for success at home. Rubens' 4th place finish in 1994 would be the last time he finished a Brazilian Grand Prix for nearly a decade. Come 12 months later, F1 and the Brazilian Grand Prix were quite a different landscape. As with so many tales we've told in the past, from that of Nigel Mansell to Bruno Senna, a huge shift in this narrative comes from the tragedy of the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix and the death of Ayrton Senna. In the aftermath, Rubens had gone on to take his maiden pole position, the youngest to have done so at that point in time, and a strong season lifted him to rank 6th in the drivers' table, the highest a Jordan would rank until Heinz-Harald Frenzen's title challenging heroics a few years later. With Senna gone, the Brazilians had a new chosen one. It was a lot to bear for those young shoulders, and the 1995 Brazilian Grand Prix reflected an attitude of trying too hard. Rubens ached to emulate friend and mentor Senna and bring some joy to the Brazilian faithful, which was reflected in an updated helmet that weekend that paid tribute to Ayrton. But because of that, he was overdriving the car, qualifying a lowly 16th with a myriad of engine problems, and then retiring early on from 12th with a broken gearbox actuator. On reflection in 2013, Rubens has said that if I could relive that weekend, I wouldn't. I felt like I was doing something for somebody else and I wasn't being myself. But give it a year and Rubens was older, wiser, and more importantly, faster. He was 3rd fastest in second practice and then a magnificent 2nd in qualifying, beaten only by champion-to-be Damon Hill, even with an engine running with reduced revs to preserve reliability. Rubens proclaimed it a better lap than even his pole lap of Belgium in 94. I was lucky to be on the track at the right moment there, but here I was fighting with the big boys. To underline how strong everything was looking, he was 4th fastest in the Sunday warm-up and just 0.03 from the fastest man, teammate Martin Brundle. When the rain began to fall 40 minutes before the race started, it offered an intriguing proposition. The Jordans were looking rapid in the perfect sunshine and in the mix for a podium, but in the rain, the sport's great equaliser, maybe something sensational could happen. Hill bogged down at the start, and for the briefest of moments it looked like Rubens might be able to capitalise, but the Williams scrabbled to find some traction and shot off, and soon Jacques Villeneuve and Jean Alesi were passed too. Thus started a fantastic battle for third place as Barrichello tried time and again to squeeze past Alesi, only to be rebuffed at every occasion with Schumacher in hot pursuit of the pair of them. On lap 27, Villeneuve tumbled out of the race, and now Barrichello was on course for third place, and maybe better. Trouble was that pesky rain. It had died down, and as the track began to improve, the question was when to make that switch to dry tyres and capitalise on the enormous advantage it could bring. David Coulthard was the first to do so, but it was too much too soon, and so the Jordans and Schumacher elected to switch to a fresh set of wets before another later stop for dry tyres. But Hill and Alesi stayed out, and turns out that was the right call. When the duo pitted for their one and only stop, they were home and dry in every sense of the word, but there was still a battle for third. After his switch to dries on lap 44, Rubens was fourth, but swarming all over the back of Schumacher. On lap 60, the text of "everybody likes that" flashed up on screen as Rubens lunged past at turn 1, but the dastardly Deutschlander dove back past as they exited that downhill curve. As they reached the end of the back straight, the fight came to a screeching halt as Barrichello spun and tumbled off the circuit. The heartbroken hometown supports began to leave in their thousands as Murray Walker exclaimed that it is heartbreak time for the young Brazilian. He's blown it. Rubens, though, hit back with the rebuttal that it was simply a case of his brakes overheating from the previous manoeuvre, which had caught him out. Whichever direction you point the blame, it should have been a well-deserved, very popular home podium. Remarkably, that could have been the end of the video. As 96 went on, Jordan and Barrichello drifted apart, as Rubens began to feel more isolated and surplus to requirements. So bad did things get that around September there was serious consideration for Barrichello to follow the likes of the Fittipaldi family in the off-trod path from F1 to IndyCar. Carl Hogan of Penske even approached Jordan to ask for their permission to get Rubens to come test for them. But along came another of F1's notable figures, Sir Jackie Stewart. After a litany of successes in the junior classes, Stewart Grand Prix were entering the big leagues for 97, and whilst the more recent batch of F1 debutants had proved as competent as a group of Ferrari strategists, Stewart looked a very good prospect. It was well financed, and with the heavy backing of motorsport giants Ford, many saw it as a Ford factory effort in all but name. And guiding all that was the wise old head of the three-time world champion. He was the best teacher you could have, said Rubens. He is a guy who really put his heart and his passion into being a racing driver and making the show better. Here was an opportunity for Rubens to build and sculpt his own outfit, and that was a prospect that he relished. As clear number one, this was his outfit, and one that could give him that chance, not necessarily to win in Brazil by the next year, but to build momentum towards that moment. Sadly, the first two Stewart years were nothing much to write about, and bar a brilliant second place at the 97 Monaco Grand Prix, most races ended in a plume of smoke by the side of the road for the Tartan Terrors, and Rubens' results in the 97 and 98 editions of his home race reflected just that. In 97, he was stranded on the grid at the start, which mercifully kept him clear of a chaotic start that prompted a red flag, and allowed him another crack at the whole starting a race thing. But Rubens might have felt it would have been better just to dip after that first no start, as he dawdled around in 13th for 16 laps before suspension trouble struck. 1998 was the most uneventful home race by far, which is perhaps best summed up that within the 10,000 plus words of notes for this video, just 5 concerned that year. Barrichello suffered another transmission failure. That was one of several lowlights in what was Rubens' worst year to that point. Years after he finished in F1, he reflected that the SF02 was probably the worst car I've ever driven. And considering some of the cars that Brazilian backside was in later on, that's saying something. Thus, it wasn't a surprise to see Rubens make a subtle motion towards the exit door once more. He was heavily linked to a switch to Williams for 99, but was unable to raise the funds to extract himself from his Stewart contract. Once more, we might well ponder what if, Had Rubens jumped on board there, 99 would be the start of an upward curve for Williams, with BMW coming on board for 2000, powering Sir Frank's team onwards to race wins and championship challenges. One can only imagine Rubens thriving as the presumable number one in a competitive outfit free of the shenanigans of team orders hovering about their pits, unlike other future teams in Barrichello's future. Cough, hack, Ferrari, wheeze, cough, splutter. The 99 Williams, though, paled in comparison to the 99 Stewart, which all of a sudden was on the ascendancy. It was lighter, sleeker and faster. The negative atmosphere of 98 had done a quick 180, and now there were murmurings of better times on the road ahead. With this car, I believe that, if circumstances are favourable to us, we would win a race, boasted Sir Jackie at the car's launch. Those prophetic words nearly came to fruition at the season opener in Australia. Though the record books will show it was just a 5th place finish, many who watched the race would happily testify that this was a race win that had slipped through Stewart's fingers, first after both cars ignited whilst waiting on the grid, and then, with Rubens having charged through from the pit lane, receiving a 10-second stop-and-go penalty after a safety car infringement. "I could have won," cried Rubens in the garage after. "If I had started from my proper 4th place, I could have won." With that bristling potential in place, and a car that Rubens claimed for the first time was one that allowed me to race and to overtake, it was time to go back for Rubens' most realistic shot at a home win yet. Rubens and his Stewart flew to 3rd on the grid, trumped only by the rapid McLaren pairing. At the start, that became 2nd when Coulthard stalled on the grid, and then just a handful of laps later, Mika Häkkinen's transmission went on a brief fritz, sending the home crowd wild as Rubens rocketed past into the lead. For the first time since Senna in 94, a Brazilian led at home. Stewart recalls the roar of the grandstands chanting for his driver as a remarkable experience. For 23 glorious laps, Rubens continued to lead, but quickly it became apparent that this was only due to a difference in strategies between Stewart and the chasing Ferrari and McLaren. They were planning just one stop, while the Stewart would be going for 2 trips to the pit lane. After the first round of stops, Rubens inevitably slipped back, but still found himself in a strong 3rd place and on course for his maiden podium at home, until lap 43 when the engine's gudgeon pin, a real thing that I absolutely know how it looks and what it does, failed, and thus the whole thing came to a screeching halt. Painfully, this failure was brought about by the flickering potential shown in Australia. There, the Cosworth crew had rev-limited the Stewart engines over concerns regarding durability, but with Stewart looking so competitive, they whacked up those revs to the Ford 17,250 RPM, and it proved too much for the package. Stewart's stock continued to rise as the year went on, leading to the team's first win at the Nürburgring, and their eventual morphing into the ill-fated Ford Works outfit of Jaguar. But whilst Rubens would neatly dodge the poison chalice of that particular jaded journey, many would argue he simply swapped one of those festering cups for another with his next career move as he stepped into the lion's den of Schumacher's Ferrari. Joining Ferrari provided Rubens the most competitive equipment he'd ever enjoyed during the entirety of his 19 years in F1, as the statistics will demonstrate from Ferrari's run of 5 consecutive drivers and constructors title doubles. During that time, the prancing horse took 2/3 of all wins, 60% of all poles, and scored nearly 1,000 points, more than closest rivals McLaren and Williams combined. A shot at some Interlagos inspiration was still a little way off though, and his first 3 Brazilian races with Ferrari would bring him closer to the podium, if not quite the top step he might have wanted. In 2000, McLaren and Ferrari were nip and tuck with the other, as evidenced by the qualifying gaps in Brazil, where half a second covered Häkkinen on pole and Barrichello in 4th, with a gulf of 7 tenths going back to 5th placed man Giancarlo Fisichella. The gap could have been even smaller to the front as Rubens' final lap was thwarted by some pesky red flags, without which he might have started 2nd. Barrichello bounced back and forth from 3rd early on as he duelled with Coulthard, and not long after that slipped past Häkkinen for 2nd. Soon Schumacher pitted and Rubens was back in the lead at home for the 2nd year running, before he too stopped, emerging back out in 4th place. And just a handful of laps later, he peeled into the pits once more to retire with a hydraulics failure. With Häkkinen retiring and Coulthard disqualified thanks to an illegal front wing end plate, it marked yet another near miss on a welcome first home podium. Still, if the 2000 Brazilian Grand Prix had some tight qualifying, the 2001 edition would nudge that in the side and say, hey, hold my beer. Schumacher was on pole but just a 10th covered brother Ralph in second, and Rubens in 6th place, meaning any of those 6 could be in the hunt come Sunday. Yet hopes of a big Brazilian bonus went out the window before the race even started. Barrichello was leaving the pits for the grid formation lap when his engine broke, his second failure of the weekend. Back to the garage ran Rubens for the less than welcome sight of a spare car that was set up for Michael. With just half a minute to spare, Rubens was able to slither out of the pits and onto the grid. Understandably, it then led to a race of fluster, bluster and little else. He dropped back a place at the start, and whilst Juan Pablo Montoya was delivering a masterclass in overtaking at the first corner, Rubens had seemingly forgotten to take notes on that matter as he clattered into the back of the other Schumacher, tearing off the Ferrari's right front and bringing a panicked few moments to a clumsy close. To be fair to Rubens, the cars of Schumacher and Trulli in front had suddenly veered from the left to the right, but as reports of the time said, a driver of his quality and experience should have read that situation and reacted accordingly. It would now be unsurprising to learn that it could have and should have been a podium, if unlikely to be that long-craved first win. Even factoring in race leader Montoya's retirements from a Jos Verstappen-shaped torpedo, Coulthard was untouchable that day, and the only glimpse of positivity was a couple of major errors from Michael that might have allowed Barrichello to slip through into second place. And that's assuming that Ferrari wouldn't have got onto the radio with a phrase that sounds somewhat similar to Bream Borders. Speaking of 2002, one might have assumed that with Ferrari's next offering, the F2002, one of F1's more dominant machines, good results would have been on the cards then. It won 15 of the 19 races it was entered in, set new points total records in the drivers' and constructors' tables, and so dominant were the Ferrari pair, not even the combination of all 20 other drivers' points could topple it. What more could you ask for? Well, perhaps to actually get to drive that car. Ferrari had started the year running the F2001B, an evolution of their 2001 model before the new car was ready. But with the Williams pair having trumped Ferrari the previous round and Brazil hotly anticipated to be another white and blue procession, giving the Michelin tyre superiority in humid conditions, the F2002's debut was hastily fast-forwarded, but to the tune of just one model for Schumacher, whilst Rubens would have to wait a little while longer. And whilst Michael was showcasing just how good the remainder of the year would be in that Scarlet Speedster, in what was deemed a simply brilliant drive from the ever-successful German, it was, almost obligatorily now, all going wrong for Rubens. And he wasn't hanging around this time either, as he spun off on his first quick lap in the first practice session. By the end of qualifying, he was only 8th with his best time disallowed after running the pit lane red light. But with a lighter fuel load, he provided plenty of theatrics on Sunday as he carved his way through the field, passing pairs of McLarens, Renaults and Schumachers to take the lead on lap 14. He had led for just 2 laps in the 2000 edition before conking out, and this time he made it to an eye-watering, jaw-dropping 3 before his hydraulics failed. Another probable podium went by the wayside, and one can only wonder what could have been, if not in a year-old car. Up to now, we have seen and discussed a variety of home races and the subsequent ifs, buts and what could have beens, but none would provide the golden opportunity for a nailed-on hometown win, like the next 2 years would do. In 2003, Rubens took pole position, the first Brazilian to do so since Senna nearly a decade previously. Better yet, the omens were on his side for once, for a Brazilian had won their home race in 73, 83 and 93. So surely this was when it all came right? If it was, then the F1 gods didn't want to make it easy for poor Rubens. Sunday brought about a torrential downpour that started 3 hours before the race start and stubbornly refused to dissipate. At a crumbling old track with draining about as efficient as a mobile chicane upload schedule, a pool of water was quickly gathering at spots such as the Curva del Sol, meaning aquaplaning, the act of tyres losing all contact with the road due to a thick layer of water, was a real threat. Worse yet, every car only had access to intermediate tyres, with full wets nowhere to be seen. The rain began to ease, and 15 minutes late, the cars peeled off around the circuit, tucked in behind the safety car for the first 8 laps. Understandably cautious, Rubens soon dropped behind the likes of Coulthard, Raikkonen, Montoya and Schumacher. But what's that faint ringing in the background? Ah, it's the alarm. Tick-tock, accident o'clock. Justin Wilson was the first to go, followed promptly by Ralph Furman taking out Olivier Panis. Then Montoya and Antonio Pizzoni aquaplaned off at turn 3, and they were joined by Schumacher just a couple of laps after that. With Raikkonen pitting, Rubens was now back up to second and set his sights on Coulthard, as the likes of Verstappen and Button added their names to the members' list of the Crashers Club. By lap 44, the duo were in a league of their own, lapping 2 seconds faster than all others, and the crowd roared as Coulthard ran wide into turn 1, and Rubens thanked him kindly for the lead. The cheers lasted for 2 laps and abruptly turned to groans when, for their 9th consecutive year, Barrichello ground to a halt. Initially, it had been assumed that an electronics failure was to blame, but the cause this time was a reason that would even make modern-day Ferrari look competent. Rubens had run out of fuel. Spokesperson Luca Colgiani explained this was owing to rain interfering with the telemetry, but that failed to soften the blow even slightly. Past results had been lost podiums, but this was undeniably the first win that had slipped through Barrichello's fingers. With the gap he was stretching out over Coulthard, if he had pitted before the red flag, he would have most likely still emerged in front of the leading duo of Raikkonen and Fisichella, and had the race continued, then his margin of victory would likely need to be measured with a calendar rather than a stopwatch. To be objective though, any number of drivers could well have won on that chaotic day. If Minardi's Paul Stoddart can make a case that Verstappen could have won that day, you can almost certainly do the same for any other driver in the field, if only they'd avoided that patch of rainwater or if luck had been on their side. Still, 2003 pales in comparison to 2004. If you were to sit in a writer's room and thrash out the best possible opportunity for Rubens to win at home, you would be hard-pressed to scribble out a better scenario than what Rubens faced in 2004. For starters, the race had been moved from its usual early season slot to the season finale. Rather than the beginning of a championship fight, it now signalled a victory lap for Ferrari, with both championships having long since been secured. With that came a different Schumacher. Though Michael had decimated the opposition that year, winning 12 of the first 13 races, he had since fully embodied the meme of done for the day, with a dreadful drive to 12th in China last time out being a particular lowlight. If that wasn't enough to assume that Shuey would be out of the picture, Michael confirmed he would be a non-factor in the race, when he crashed during Saturday practice, prompting a switch to the spare car and a change of engine, through which he received a 10-place penalty, leaving him mired down in 18th place, with a metric ton of fuel on board to combat that. Rubens, on the contrary, was in scintillating form. He arrived at Interlagos on the back of 2 wins and 2 poles from the last 3 races, meaning Ferrari had won all but 2 of the year's 17 races thus far, and with the team, quote, giving me the VIP feeling, so I'm feeling good. Rubens duly rattled off his 2nd successive Brazilian pole. Perfect position, perfect timing, perfect car, perfect form. Schumacher out of the picture. Surely this time, with all the stars aligned for Rubens, nothing could go wrong, right? Wrong. For starters, that dominant Ferrari form was actually a hindrance to his hopes. With both titles having wrapped up 2 months previously, the F2004's development had ground to a shuddering halt, as perhaps indicated by Schumacher going MIA in recent races, and the likes of the Williamses and McLarens had inevitably caught up. And just to wipe out that gap entirely, along came the rain once again. 30 minutes before the start, dark clouds rolled in and started to beat a steady drizzle onto the track. When queried on what impact that might have, Rubens responded, "In the dry, we're fastest. In the wet, we're fastest. But in the damp, we're in trouble." And so it proved. In those mildly moist conditions, his Bridgestone tyres could not reach their operating peak the way that those on the Michelins could do. Raikkonen moved past early on, though Rubens retook the lead a few laps later as Kimi and others began to pit for dry tyres. 3 laps later, Barrichello did the same, but just a lap too late. By doing so, he lost the lead, track position, and subsequently the race. By the time his Bridgestones came up to temperature a long while later, the best he could do was match the pace of leaders Raikkonen and Montoya, with the gap between the duo and himself remaining stubbornly static. Rubens had to settle for a crestfallen third, a long overdue podium, but a long way away from what could have been that day, with just a few more millimetres of rain. It seemed like that had been the last opportunity for Rubens. To his dismay, the 2005 Ferrari was miles away from the superiority he'd enjoyed the previous years, and he arrived at Interlagos with just a third of the points he'd scored by the same stage 12 months prior. Unsurprisingly, there was no third successive home pole, and instead he was down in 9th, blaming his mechanics for incorrectly pressurised tyres. Race day was spent circulating in the lower points, and though Rubens claimed that without his qualifying woes I could have had a much better race, it was unlikely to overcome the minute-plus deficit to race winner Montoya by the end. In a year's time, Ferrari would be right back at the pointy end once more, but sans a Barrichello in their bunch. In August 2005, he announced he was off to Honda, with hopes that being free of the toxicity of Schumacher and Ferrari could allow him to truly shine. Looking at pre-season testing, it seemed the right call, as Rubens and new teammate Jenson Button topped the timesheets, but it was clear Rubens was struggling to adapt to a new car, stating it wasn't easy to get in and drive compared to the Ferrari, and quickly it became apparent the likes of the Scuderia, Renault, Raikkonen and Button all had their measure of Rubens. That was reflected in both the final year's points tally and the 2006 Brazilian Grand Prix, with Barrichello 7th in both behind all those aforementioned names. Though Rubens would say later on, "I don't think I could have stayed one more year at Ferrari. I was happier driving a shit car than being told what to do." You wonder how true that was in 2006 when he would have seen compatriot Felipe Massa in his first Brazilian Grand Prix for Ferrari, driving the car Barrichello had originally been contracted to race, taking an emotional first home win. Just as painful were the next 2 years for Rubens, as Honda's last 2 F1 cars were as effective as a fridge in an igloo. A tired trudge through 2007 culminated in yet another hometown retirement, this time marking Rubens' first ever pointless campaign in the Premier class. There was considerable chat that this would be his last Grand Prix for Honda, with talks of a demotion to sister outfit Super Aguri, or just an unceremonious booting from F1 altogether. But Rubens clung on and arrived back at Interlagos a year later via a surprise trip to the podium in Silverstone, to find the rumour mill cranking out the same old story. Far from this being the day that Rubens finally got over his home-based hoodoo, it would be the final day of the grizzled veteran's long F1 career. They gestured over at another old-timer in Coulthard, hailing his final race before retirement with celebrations and cake, and raised an inquisitive eye at Rubens as if to say, "Did you think about maybe doing that? You're 36, out of favour, and another Brazilian in Bruno Senna is being lined up for your seat." If race day was his finale, it was an unfitting one. He went from the dizzying heights of 15th to a jaw-dropping 15th at the flag, with a gamble on extreme wets failing to come off. As Massa stood atop the podium for the second time, Rubens slunk out of the paddock saying to himself, "I'll be back, I'm sure of it." By now, we all know the tale of Brawn. An abrupt F1 withdrawal by Honda, a hurried and desperate scramble for new owners, Ross Brawn buying the outfit for a symbolic £1, and after all that, a brilliant title double. Wrapped within that saga was the fairy tale return to the spotlight for Barrichello, who went from queuing at the job centre to racing at the front of the F1 field once more, and a return to winning ways. He arrived in Brazil in the midst of a title battle, with he and Sebastian Vettel trailing longtime leader Button by 14 and 16 points respectively, with just 20 left to play for. If there was ever a time for Rubens' lifetime of rotten misfortune at home to pay him back twofold, it was now. The gods obliged, and amidst one of F1's most tropical and elongated qualifying sessions, it was Rubens who emerged on top for his first pole since Brazil 2004, whilst title rivals Button and Vettel were languishing down in 14th and 16th places. If Barrichello won and Button failed to climb higher than 4th, a title showdown in Abu Dhabi was on the cards. He led the opening 20 laps, but soon it became apparent that an early safety car and a blitz of pace from Mark Webber had handed the advantage to the Australian, and soon the Red Bull and then BMW's Robert Kubica scampered past. Down to thirds, now Hamilton was swarming all over his gearbox. On lap 62, he dived past the Brawn. Rubens tried to close the door, and the McLaren's front wing end plate gave an unwelcome handshake to Barrichello's left rear, causing a slow puncture and another trip into the pits. He came home in 8th, Button was 5th, and the title fight was over. Ever the gentleman, Rubens admitted, "While I am disappointed with the result, it's been an amazing year, and I am pleased for Jensen as a friend." 2009 marked not just the last time Rubens led his home Grand Prix, but the last time he ever led an F1 race. It could have been different as we make another quick sojourn into What If Junction. McLaren offered Barrichello a contract for 2010, which would have allowed Rubens to park his keister in one of the best cars that year and offer the possibility of continuing to win races for at least the next 3 years. But he'd previously signed a contract with Williams, already on a winless run of 5 years, and one that would carry on for a little while longer. And Rubens, admirably or foolishly, chose to honour that contract. Rubens' first home race in blue came off the back of a streak of 4 point-scoring finishes in a row, and with a comfortable advantage over his teammate, a very young Nico Hülkenberg, in the standings. So who was it that put a Williams on pole for the first time in 5 years and caused a young chicane to punch through a lampshade with delight? Hülkenberg, of course, timing his run beautifully in mixed conditions to take pole by over a second. Rubens, meanwhile, was back in 6th. Nico's slow slide back through the pack showed this would never have been a victory opportunity had their positions been reversed, but Rubens was still on track for a tidy points haul until a wheel nut problem slowed him at the stops, and then a clash with Jaime Alguersuari brought about a puncture, another stop, and a 14th place finish. Rubens ranked 10th by year's end, but 2011 would prove drastically more uncompetitive, and his points tally shrank from 47 to 4 by the time he arrived in Interlagos. Not for the first time, it was with the grey clouds of an uncertain future swirling once more. The rumour mill was cranking out the news the likes of Raikkonen, Adrian Sutil or Valtteri Bottas were after his seat. Not that you would have known it was playing on Rubens' mind. He took the Williams crew karting one evening and then invited his engineers to dinner at his home on another. "This is where I belong," declared Rubens, "and I think I could even change my name to Rubens F1 Barrichello." From 12th he dropped 7 places on lap 1 and could only muster 14th place. Back in the Williams garage, Rubens got out of his F1 car for the last time. It was far from a fitting send-off to one of the sport's longest-serving statesmen. In January 2012 he was fired, and the better-back Senna slotted into his seat. Cruelly, just as Rubens departed, Williams sparked into life and returned to the winner's circle. It was a car, in many people's eyes, worthy of a top 3 spot in the championship, squandered by an erratic Pastor Maldonado and a struggling Senna. Whether the experienced Barrichello could have lifted it higher, namely at Interlagos, is a matter for debate, but given Pastor qualified 6th for the 2012 Brazilian Grand Prix only to do a Maldonado and crash out early on, and with Rubens' slight edge over the Venezuelan in 2011, there was every chance of a potential podium. It's worth adding one last addendum, that Rubens' record of 19 home races could have stretched to a nice even 20. In November 2014, it emerged he was due to return to F1 and Brazil for the final 3 races of the season with Caterham until the beleaguered outfit entered administration. Now, barring a wild series of events that would even outstrip the 2003 edition, there is little to no chance such an opportunity would have ended with a fairy tale victory, but still would have perhaps been a chance for Rubens to make a farewell to his home crowd on his terms, a la Felipe Massa shortly down the line. Before we delve into the who's, whys and what-ifs of the conclusion, it would perhaps be prudent to hastily dip back into our introduction and make some quick clarifications. Now, we boasted proudly at the beginning about just how many opportunities Rubens had to win his home race, but looking back on those 19 years, one begins to wonder just how true that might be. His machinery may often have been championship challenging, race winning, even podium potential. But how many exact moments can you say that Barrichello was truly in the hunt for a home win? Rubens sat in his fair share of rotten cars, from the woeful Williams FW33, the hideous Honda RA107, and the stagnant Stewart SF02. From his array of 19 cars, we can safely remove 10 of those on the grounds of not even being close to a win all year, let alone in Brazil. Beyond those, we must hold our hands up and admit that 3 of the cars we declared race winners were far from being regular contenders. The Stewart SF3, Ferrari F2005 and Honda RA106 all only won 1 race apiece, 2 of which came in a pair of wet and wild afternoons, and the other at the 2005 US Grand Prix, which, no further questions, Your Honour. The SF3 did admittedly take Rubens to the front in '99, but as we discussed at the time, was much more in line with a possible podium that day than any shake of a win. That drops us to 6, and really, we could omit the Brawn BGP 0012. Statistically, it was the 3rd best car Barrichello ever drove, but its performance range was as varied as a variety of variety acts at the Royal Variety Performance. It began the year with 6 wins from 7 races, but thereafter lost its advantage and slid into the clutches of the chasing pack. His pole that year flattered to deceive. Only by a few tenths did he escape Q2 that day, and it was clear even before Sunday started that Webber was the clear favourite. Still, that does leave 5 other cars who were undeniably the class of the field at one point or another. So let's pick into those 5 fantastic Ferraris. I suppose one cannot do a deep dive analysis into the life and times of Rubens Barrichello without touching on the monstrous shadow that loomed over him, the spectre of Schumacher. We said at the beginning that if one is sat in a championship-winning car, you have the best car in the field and therefore the best opportunity to win the race. But what if your car was parked opposite Michael Schumacher in the same garage? Upon his signing, hopes had been, if not high, then gently hovering. Ferrari Supremo Luca di Montezemolo said he no longer wanted the team to be focused on one driver, and Rubens even told team principal Jean Todt at their first meeting, "If it's written in my contract that I will not be able to race for myself and win, I'm not interested. I want to be free to race." Journalists and fans alike were less sure. Ferrari was a great team, but it was irrefutably Michael's team. And for Rubens, that became apparent very early on. In the first few races, I was getting faster and faster and closer to Michael, said Rubens. And then they started to talk about things that were not written in the contract. The spare car, for instance, always being set up for Schumacher, wasn't on Barrichello's documents, but it was in Michael's. Strategy meetings would turn to private conversations between Schumacher and the rest of the team. There was the non-stop barrage of team orders, most notably being forced to allow Michael by at the death of the 2002 Austrian Grand Prix. As Rubens puts it, they never allowed me to be good enough. You could succinctly sum up the experience under the tagline, best car, worst opportunity. And frustratingly, a step away from that shadow was tantalisingly close repeatedly. From 2001 onwards, rumours of an impending Schumacher retirement kept on coming year after year, and it never happened. Though the likes of Raikkonen and Alonso were linked as possible replacements, which questions whether Rubens would have been the new number 1, he certainly would have been less of a number 2 with either of those two there. The pain of living through that was only exemplified by the expectation of the Brazilian faithful. It is perhaps useful to establish how different of a challenge it is for a Brazilian to win at Interlagos than, say, a Brit at Silverstone. The pressure to do well there is intensely higher because it means so much more to the public, gives them pride in their country and distracts from the numerous issues of their daily lives. One only has to look at the hysteria around Ayrton Senna there even to this day, to see what his successes meant to Brazil. And Rubens grew up in a financially poor environment just a stone's throw from Interlagos. In a way, he was closer to the Brazilian faithful than the likes of a Fittipaldi, Pache or Senna had ever been. His hometown efforts meant so much to them, and because of that, anything that wasn't success was tantamount to failure. Just witness the regular stampede of exiting fans when he too exited the race. That expectation was only magnified by the loss of Senna. When Brazil lost Ayrton, it only increased that pressure on Barrichello tenfold. Citing his experience in '95, Rubens says, "Back then, I felt as if 10th on the grid wasn't any good anymore because that used to be acceptable for me when Senna was on pole, doing the job for Brazil. And now this young 22-year-old, just 3 years into the sport, had the expectations of victory on his shoulders without the possible equipment to do so. With that came a tendency to overdrive at home, see his errors in '96 and 2001, and it took him a long time to overcome that." There is also a consideration of how this story could have been had Barrichello and his mentor and friend joined forces early on. For that, we have to jump back to 1993. Senna's McLaren team had lost their Honda engines, and with less than promising customer Ford V8s coming in instead, Ayrton was hastily scrabbling at the exit door in hopes of a more competitive seat, one of which might well have been at Jordan. Now, Jordan were entering only their 3rd season and one following a disastrous 2nd with just a single point scored, but it was also a Jordan with designer Gary Anderson, whose 191 chassis had arguably been the best handling of 1991, and a Jordan powered by Hart engines with whom Ayrton had worked closely previously. Plus, Jordan were happy to offer up 49% of his own team to allow Senna to mould it and make it his own. As outside bets go, it ranked around the same possibility of Sauber being competent at pit stops, but it was still significantly further with negotiations than many other teams could ever claim. It never came to pass, and it seemed these negotiations were merely a ploy from Senna to extract more money from his McLaren deal. But how different this tale might be had that reality come to fruition. Few would argue that a Senna-Barrichello lineup would have been nothing short of fantastic. Just think how better equipped Rubens could have been. Instead, Rubens was left alone as the sole Brazilian to bear that load. Yes, there were other Brazilians in the pack of the time, but they were names like Tarso Marques, Pedro Diniz or Enrique Bernaldi. If you're a more casual F1 observer and those names mean nothing to you, consider that there is a reason why that may be. It wasn't until Felipe Massa stepped up to Ferrari in 2006 that the Brazilians had more than one driver to cheer on, and by then, Rubens was no longer at the front to share the burden. It is a strange statement to make regarding a man with over 300 Grand Prix to his name, but to further Rubens' hometown hoodoo, he lacked a lot of experience with the circuit. Let's not forget, he left home at just 16 to tackle the racing shores of Great Britain. Whilst Interlagos was where his passport declared home, the reality was he raced very little there in his formative years in comparison to a site like Silverstone, and that difference in experience is clearly highlighted in his F1 records at both circuits. At Silverstone, he regularly raced to plentiful points and podiums, not to mention one of his more famous wins during a chaotic 2003. Magic in a place I've always loved, recounts Rubens. Even if I had bad days, I had something over Michael there. Indeed, Rubens' Ferrari form at Silverstone read a qualifying record of 5-1 during a time when Schumacher would outqualify Rubens 75% of the time, whereas at Interlagos, 2-4. From 1993 to 2011, 12 other drivers did what he never could, and won on Brazilian soil. Ask why Rubens isn't among those few, and we can reference names like Senna or Schumacher, or gesture at an enormous amount of pressure on a pair of shoulders ill-equipped to handle that. But put them together and what have you got? Bippity-boppity bad luck. And not just a series of unfortunate events like those that blighted his career, but a freak streak of unreliability. Few have ever endured such a woeful streak of misfortune on home ground. On 6 occasions he led on home soil. 3 of those times he retired whilst in the lead. When those rare occasions at Ferrari appeared where he had a fair crack of winning at home, hello 2003 and 2004, Rubens was helpless to stop his misfortunes even then. Nothing epitomises the F1 god's refusal to give the guy a break than giving him a car that had won 15 of 17 races, put it on pole with a 17-place gap to Schumacher from a dominant, meticulous team, only for just the exact amount of rain to fall to wipe his chances. And if not that, then a rare, if only blunder from Ferrari at the time to leave him out of fuel. In our favourite what-if best-case scenario universe, Rubens would have had a more than exemplary record at home. 6 podiums across 96, 99 to 2002 and 2009, to go alongside 2 wins in 03 and 04. It should have read fittingly as the best home record since Senna, but in the cold, harsh light of the real world, Rubens can only look upon his F1 trophy cabinet, one filled with 68 different awards of varying design and colour, the 9th biggest display case in F1's long history, and rummage around the back to find a singular bronze edition awarded at Interlagos. Since he left F1 via 1 year in IndyCar, Rubens has raced in the Stock Car Pro Series, Brazil's premier tier of motor racing. And thankfully there he has finally won a race in Brazil, though admittedly that statistic is less impressive when most of the racing on the calendar is located there. Perhaps a more interesting statistic to part on is this. In 13 years of stock car racing, Barrichello has still not claimed victory at Interlagos, even despite being a 2-time champion of the series. There's bad luck, and then there's Barrichello bad luck. 11 retirements from 19 starts, 10 from his first 11. There is no maths wherein the subtraction of Schumacher, the addition of Senna, or the multiplication of chances equals anything other than a torrent of rotten luck. If you do some actual mathematics and calculate the odds of retiring at 9 Brazilian Grand Prix in a row between 1996 and 2003, the odds are 0.066%, or roughly 1 in 1,515. That's about the same as the odds of being struck by lightning in your lifetime. With that in mind, it's hardly a surprise to see Rubens, F1 Barrichello, getting caught in such a perfect storm. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pit box of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pit wall that it's the best strategy available for you.